Okay. All right. So we have some important developments, very important developments to cover, and then I think that will then situate the importance of what I'm going to be presenting today, primarily, which is on physical economy. I made a presentation on this to a Democratic Party club the other day, and a week ago actually, and so this will fill that out a little bit more in some of the details. First, however, by way of introduction, my name is Brian Lantz. I've been with the LaRouche movement for 40 plus years, and through that period of time I've written many articles primarily on economics. California economy, the Chicago area economy, the Texas economy, and so on and so forth. And again, that's what we'll come back to. But here, we want to start with where we are in the world. And at this very moment, we are facing an escalation that involves two new wars that the Obama administration is lunging towards in Syria and Libya, and beyond that into confrontation directly with Russia and China. Most of you probably know that the Obama administration, Obama announced, more or less in the context of his recent trip to Saudi Arabia and then for lunch with the Queen in Buckingham Palace and on to Europe, that we're sending 250 US troops on the ground into the sovereign nation of Syria. As of today, Saturday, our best knowledge is that at least 150 of those troops are there, joining 50 that are already present. So we have now an army inside Syria. The administration has stated that its intention is the overthrow of the current government of Syria. And so this invasion is in fact an act of war. And as I think all people know by now, the Russians are there at the request of the Syrian government of Bashar Assad. And so where that can go is incalculable. And I'll just leave it at this, that in Libya, there are similar moves to involve NATO and to involve US forces directly out of the recently formed African command forces directly in Libya as well. So let's go to the broader picture, which is the escalation against Russia and China. I think most people saw in the last few days at least one or two of the three instances of confrontation, shall we say, between US aircraft and Russian aircraft over the Baltic, over the North Pacific off the coast of Russia, and the confrontation a little more than a week ago between the USS Cook, which is an Aegis-class destroyer armed with anti-ballistic missiles capable of taking out Russian defense systems and ICBM positions in the Baltic, was confronted by Russian fighter craft. This is only a small part of what's going on. The US is now committed with NATO to building up a flotilla in the Black Sea, which would in some ways be the equivalent of Russia parking a naval fleet in the Gulf of Mexico.
Really?
And likewise, the buildup is going on in the Baltic Sea, but also in the Baltic countries of Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia. Germany has been convinced, the Merkel government, to deploy German troops to Lithuania as part of a brigade-sized rotational force that's now being placed in Lithuania. The US has sent in F-22s, our most advanced fighter craft to Lithuania as a symbolic, or more than a symbolic gesture. A heavy armor brigade is being located in Poland on a rotating basis, and there are calls for that to be increased up to 3 rotating brigades in the area of Poland. And you have as well the attempts to put together various combinations, merging limited capabilities of various countries, Ukraine with Romania, with Bulgaria, and so on and so forth, to form additional brigades. Poland, for example, is announced that they're going to be increasing their force size, their ground force strength, and repositioning it on the east border of Poland, vis-a-vis Kaliningrad and Belarus and so on and so forth. All of this is going on as we speak. And the Russians are very specific in pointing to the danger this represents, an increasing danger. And it occurs in the context of the deteriorating situation in Syria. And then just very quickly, in the South China Sea off the coast of China, you've had these deployments of U.S. naval forces and air forces into the South China Sea area. This is an area in which China has very significant interests. It views it as part of the territory of China. There are disputes between countries in the region, Philippines, Vietnam, China, on where these demarcations should be in terms of their various, boundaries. But nonetheless, the U.S. is intervening from outside. Again, like the Baltic, from thousands of miles away, we're stating we have a self-interest in placing our forces directly up against the Russian border, the physical border of Russia, and directly up against the border of China, when our own interests are, of course, thousands, let's say 6,000 miles away, as a rough estimate. Now, since 2013, it's been enunciated the prompt global strike doctrine and the air-sea battle doctrines. These have been published in terms of Air Force journals. The concept is that thermonuclear war is winnable, that the advances in technology, the development of new systems, of potential new systems, hypersonic cruise missiles, hypersonic delivery systems, otherwise, give to us theoretically this utopian capability to launch a war and take out the enemy's defense capabilities and its response capabilities, and therefore clear the way for a full destruction of the enemy occupation and so on and so forth. This is a completely utopian doctrine, and has been pointed out again and again. But this is not influencing the Obama administration, the neocons, the R2P, the responsibility to protect crowd, which is really the same as the neocons, just with a different flavoring, has not prevented them from moving ahead with exactly this perspective. And as warned, this leads, of course, to an escalating arms race on both sides. Russia has announced new hypersonic cruise missiles are now in the test phase to be soon deployed within the next year or two, and you have to take that with a grain of salt, because there's a certain kind of masquerova that goes on in terms of these things. China has again tested hypersonic vehicles launched from ICBMs, that will travel at 5, 6, 7 times the speed of sound, to deliver systems, deliver warheads, and so on and so forth, whether they're nuclear or non-nuclear warheads at targets. So you have here a rapidly escalating and incalculable, in terms of consequences, geometry being developed out of the control of anyone but those attempting to start this process. And it could start really overnight. And this is something that Mr. LaRouche has been emphasizing again and again and again and again. So that's a quick summary. Now that's the context in which the real importance of the 28 pages and the explosion that's occurred over the last 3 weeks in terms of coverage, starting really in a certain sense with the Watershed 60 Minutes show, roughly 3 weeks ago exactly. This is its importance, because this is the potential. This begins to unwrap and allows us to begin deploying the capabilities in the country to stop this war drive. The 28 pages bills I've handed out, or there's a handout for everyone. If you haven't gotten it, Izzy can get it to you, on the House and Senate bills of HB 14 and the Senate companion bill, and then the JASTA bill. This is the Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism-backed bill. You have the Senate Bill 2040 and the House Bill 3815. These bills are now all in motion with bipartisan support. You have Senator Schumer and Gillibrand of New York, both demanding action on this legislation. Gillibrand broke with Obama to stress, or more than stress, demand that the 28 pages, the concluding chapter of the Joint Congressional Inquiry into the causes of 9/11, be released before Obama went to Saudi Arabia to meet with King Salman and his extended family. That didn't occur, but nonetheless, there are now substantial demands coming from Democrats and simultaneous Republicans have stepped up on this. John Cornyn of Texas is a co-sponsor on the JASTA bill now before the U.S. Senate, which could be voted on within the next week. It may not. Lindsey Graham has a hold on it, even though he's a co-sponsor on the bill. So there's games going on. The FBI is deploying to try to stop action on this legislation, on both of these pieces of legislation, and so on and so forth. The Obama administration most emphatically is stating that they will not sign on to, Obama will not sign on to the JASTA bill as written. And of course, Obama has been, has jammed up the release of the 28 pages ever since he came into office, following on the Bush administration. But nonetheless now, whether it's the Chicago Tribune, Obama's hometown paper, or it's the New York Times, or it's Atlantic Monthly, or on and on and on and on. NPR Radio interviewed Bob Graham, Senator Bob Graham, the co-chair of the Joint Inquiry into 9/11, just this last Thursday. It just keeps coming. National Interest, which is a rather hardline neocon, or certainly kind of a hard-nosed, as I said, a publication on foreign policy, had a blog piece the other day on
National Forum?
National Interest.
Oh, National Interest, okay.
The online publication. You can find it easily.
Oh, yeah,
They had they had a blog article on this very topic, that on both bills, to the effect that on both bills, Obama has to side with the people of the United States, the families and victims of 9/11, as against Saudi Arabia. So there's a real debate, and I would just emphasize what is behind this debate. Don't simply look at the shadows, which is what you're seeing be, presented to you directly. Try to see behind the shadows, or look for what is casting the shadows, to use the Socrates analogy or
Plato.
parable.
Yeah.
It's what's casting the shadows is a brawl going on within the institutions of the United States over the war danger, most emphatically, over the war danger and where this is taking us very rapidly. That's what's happening. So the 28 pages, the JASTA bill, this is a combination which, if the American understand this in terms of its exposure not only of the Saudis, but of the British Empire, and it's the joint kingdom between the British and the Saudi kingdoms, what that represents as an actual enemy, and understands what this set tells us about the FBI, the FBI's ongoing role since its inception, and certainly since the Cold War, even before Franklin Roosevelt was dead, forward, the deployment of the FBI against the American people, the killing of the Kennedy brothers, of Martin Luther King, Operation Frumention, targeting black elected officials in the United States, the targeting of NASA through such operations as Operation Lightning Strike in the early 90s, right here in Houston, on through today. The FBI has been the enforcer of the Wall Street London Axis policies, and that is exposed as well, and they are scrambling. They are scrambling. I just mentioned there's an article that appeared in the Los Angeles Times in 2009, which you can look up. It's an interview with Louis Freeh, who was at that time the former director of the FBI, and he speaks and is interviewed with by the Los Angeles Times as the attorney representing Bandar, Prince Bandar, the former ambassador to the United States from Saudi Arabia,
And that should be a conflict of interest.
and attempting to explain why $2 billion was moved from the British BAE military company as part of a deal with the Saudi Arabian royal family and government to Bandar's account at Riggs Bank in Washington, D.C., where he had 20 plus accounts, $2 billion. And that this was only, according to Louis Freeh, this great upholder of integrity in government, this is only the way they do business. Even the article quotes numbers of individuals saying that this is really beyond the pale for Louis Freeh to be representing Bandar in this situation. But nonetheless, this was spelled out, in the press, and the role of the FBI. If you saw the 60 Minutes show 3 weeks ago, and if you haven't, certainly just Google 60 Minutes CBS or vice versa, and you can get it and watch it. And you have former Secretary of the Navy Lehman explaining to 60 Minutes how he sat down with former Senator Bob Brown, with the director of the FBI at the time, I always forget his name, Robert Mueller, and to request that the 28 pages be released. And Mueller specifically saying no, and when this is according to Lehman, and when they asked him why this could not be done, when virtually every member of the Joint Commission of Inquiry thought that it should be done and could be done, Mueller said, "I'm simply telling you no. There's no explanation. There's simply, my answer is no." So this is Freeh, this is Mueller, this is the FBI. These are, and as Bob Graham explains on the show and otherwise on NPR, he and his friends had to fight the devil to get the FBI to release 80,000 documents from Saratoga, Florida's FBI office on their investigations into the Saratoga, Florida end of the 9/11 hijacker conspiracy. The FBI had told the committee and the Citizens Commission inquiry into 9/11 that they had turned over all documents. And then, lo and behold, approximately a year ago, 80,000 documents were turned up, were forced through FOIA and so forth. And those are now being reviewed by a judge. They haven't even been made public yet. They're still being reviewed by a federal judge down there. But this is how this just goes to the whole, shall we say, can of worms. So the coming days, the immediate days here, we're focusing our national efforts on Manhattan, in New York City, ground zero in more ways than one, but everywhere, congressmen and senators, organizations, veterans groups, first responders, and so forth, need to be mobilized to break through now on this front, seeing that the iron is hot. There is a fight, and we could tip the balance. So now, moving on, or going deeper, maybe that's a better way of putting it, going deeper into this. Why the war danger? And that's what really, I'd like you to keep that in the back of your mind. The question, well, why is this drive for war? Why is this going on? Why is this going on today? You know, is this just, are you saying there's just some conspiracy, some obsession, to go to war, or some simple-minded, oh, it's the military-industrial complex and they want to make money selling weapons, right? That's not to denigrate President Eisenhower in terms of what he was getting at in terms of the military-industrial complex. That's more of where we're going. But to go there, you've got to look at the world economy, humanity's economy, the physical economy, and look at what's going on here and what the implications of this are. The physical economy, what do I mean? I mean, very briefly, it's how we feed and clothe not only ourselves but the next generation. It's the issue of durable, as Mr. LaRouche has emphasized for decades, it's the issue of durable survival, not survival in terms of the survival of the fittest or something of that sort, or just surviving day to day, but durable survival, because we have limited resources. Our technologies at any point in time only allow us access to certain resources. Whether it becomes coal or it becomes nuclear power or fusion or examples in any other field, medicine and so on and so forth. The question is, the developed are to continue to exist, we need to develop continually new resources, a new resource base, and that process is a physical process. It's not a question of money, right? The fixation in terms of modern economy is on money, and of course then it's all become computerized and digitalized, and so it becomes even more abstract, more removed from the underlying real economy. So take the example of manufacturing. Okay. People can agree, well, manufacturing, that's substantive, that's the physical economy. Well, let me ask a question about the US, just the US part of manufacturing. What do you think the largest single manufacturing product or set of products is in the US economy today? What's the thing we manufacture the most of in terms of the official calculations of these things?
Cell phone.
Computer-related stuff, cell phone stuff.
Silicone breasts.
Well, well, it's more mundane than that. But it's right under your nose. It's right there. It's refined petroleum products. She said I didn't hear it. Yeah, refined petroleum products. Specifically gasoline, fuel oil, jet fuel, and liquefied refinery gases. Okay, not even plastics. That's a different category, right? But that's by far and away the largest manufacturing product in the United States, which I don't even think of as being. I mean, not to denigrate refineries and refinery workers and so on, but I don't think of it as a manufacturing process, in terms of factories, you know, and industry, in that sense. Okay, so what is the number 2 product? Quite a ways back, but what's the number 2 product? And it's not any things the things that got mentioned here in terms of although if you look at the stock market, right, it's Yahoo and what are these? Facebook, are the you know these are the
plastics. I mean, what is? Can you rephrase this question again?
What's America's number 2 top manufacturing product? That is manufactured here.
Well, I don't know what. Well, yeah.
Well, that's right. I mean, I'm not trying to.
Weapons. Weapons.
Light trucks.
Oh, light trucks.
What you see moving down the freeway.
Oh,
light trucks.
Oh.
Like heavy pickups, that kind of thing.
Oh, you're not even saying
Well,
automobiles. You're
no,
saying trucks.
Trucks, light trucks.
Oh, okay.
That's the number 2 product.
Trucks.
Okay.
Okay.
And then you get down to pharmaceuticals, airplanes, automobiles, iron and steel, animal slaughtering, plastics, organic chemicals, and so on and so forth. Okay. But but that's just to give you an idea in terms of the U.S. economy as it exists right now. We'll come back to that in a little bit. By comparison, I don't have in terms of figures in terms of how these things stack up in terms of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, but comparing, and we'll get into this a little bit more too, just briefly to just mention China. China is now the number 1 producer and consumer in the world of machine tools, and it's machine tools that make machines that produce things. By far and away, they're the largest now, not only consuming, but producing. And most of the companies are actually Chinese firms now, although there's a number of German and other firms that have moved to China and set up operations there, obviously, you know, and they're welcome there. They're operating 31 nuclear power plants, and this year they'll complete construction for 23 more. So they'll have 54 nuclear power plants. They're building 6 to 8 nuclear power plants a year up through 2020, and so on and so forth.
Oh my God.
You know, you're all familiar with the rail, 12,000 miles of high-speed rail, and by 2020 they intend to have 20,000 high-speed rail miles built. That's miles, not kilometers. So this is some of what China's doing. We don't have a single mile of high-speed rail, and we're shutting down our nuclear power plants and reducing energy consumption. Now, you may have seen, this is shifting the ground a little bit, about a week ago, articles appeared that named that that 5 of the top too big to fail banks, they had failed their living well tests. I don't know, maybe that went right over your head, maybe.
Forgot what that was.
Right.
Too big to fail.
Too big to fail, yes. In other words, banks like Wells Fargo, Bank of America, and so forth failed a test. They had presented these programs by which they would unwind themselves in the case of a financial crisis, a crisis of their own institution, that they had sufficient liquidity and underlying capital resources and so forth that they could liquidate and walk away and met their obligations. Okay? Well, they failed it for the 3rd year in a row. They've been trying to get these things shaped up, at least to sell to the public, that these living wills exist. And therefore, the idea that banks, these too big to fail banks, will not be too big to fail, that they could fail and not have to be bailed out. Because otherwise, if they are too big to fail, it means they have to be bailed out one way or another, or bailed in, or both, to stop it from becoming a systemic tidal wave through the whole system and the whole economy, as in 2007 through 2009.
Tell us the 2 banks that didn't fail.
If I remember right, let's see, Citigroup won provisional approval from both the Federal Reserve and the FDIC. Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley escaped, having their plans termed non-credible, but they didn't get a failing grade. Goldman Sachs' plan was faulted by the FDIC and Morgan Stanley's by the Fed. But the others, JP Morgan, Mellon, State Street, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, all just completely, utterly failed. All right?
Wow.
Now, that is the context in which you had also just a week ago, you had the Fed's Minneapolis president, the president of the Minneapolis Federal Reserve branch, Neil Kashkari, at a speech in Washington, D.C., public speech, come out and say the banks are too big, are still too big to fail. And we've got to act on this. This is becoming more and more serious. This is not something that we're getting, that we're getting a handle on. And he emphasized that the question is not simply the cost of a bailout. Again, money, money, money. It's not a matter, I'm emphasizing that point. He said it's the economic damage that's inflicted across society, right, by a bailout. Right? So what do we have? We have, we have a building financial crisis, and we have a collapsing physical economy. And let me just go on a little bit here to the physical economy here. Again, just focusing on the United States, but Europe, if anything, is in worse shape. It's certainly in no better shape. So let me go to this first overhead projection. And I hope we didn't just lose our light bulb. We stopped manufacturing.
We have that important.
The power is on. It's plugged in. Let's see if we can switch to another bulb.
Oh, it's just working.
Yeah, it was just working, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it looks like.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's all right. I'll just proceed here without the overheads. And then if people would like, I can make some copies of them afterwards, people can, to take with them. But I'm drawing on some figures that were from a report last year, published by, sponsored by the Aspen Institute. Why is capital investment consistently weak in the 21st century U.S. economy? Yeah. And I'm not endorsing their proposals or solutions, but what they present, or drawing on U.S. Bureau of Economic Statistics and Economic Analysis, that is from the government itself, they present a very depressing picture of the Depression.
Wow.
The first aspect of that, there has been no growth in domestic investment. In fact, it's been negative since 2005 for the U.S. economy on total. The largest leap since the 60s in net investment, domestic investment in the U.S. economy was 1994 to 2000. And if you remember that period, that was the information age dot-com bubble. Yep. So from the standpoint of the physical economy, as LaRouche would define it, and as we said at the time, it was a bubble. And that investment, while computers are useful, they contribute potentially to all sorts of processes, CAD, CAM, so on and so forth, in terms of manufacturing and related areas. Point is that big boost in investment, so-called, in that 94 to 2000 period is something that would have to be looked at very carefully and whittled down. But essentially from a bar that shoots up yay high, after the year 2000, that collapsed down to almost nothing, and has now gone negative since 2007. So there's no net investment in the economy, U.S. economy. There are, as they point out, virtually no net investment in equipment, which is a more narrowly defined category. And again, you can play games with these things. You can imagine you can include all kinds of things under the heading of equipment. But nonetheless, we had an actual destruction of the U.S. capital base and equipment base of the U.S. economy in the 2007-2009 period. And we've essentially been flatlined ever since. So there's no economic investment in equipment, nor is there any net government investment. Think of NASA and so forth and so on, right? Government investment is the multiplier effect from government investment when conceived of from the standpoint of a Franklin Roosevelt, John F. Kennedy perspective, a LaRouche perspective, right? Where you're pinpointing areas of the economy that will drive it forward as either a science driver or as a technology driver, or both. Government investment is absolutely critical, and there has been no major economic program or economic recovery period in the United States that has existed without the U.S. playing the primary role, including going back to the Transcontinental Railroad and further back even to the Erie Canal and so on and so forth. But the U.S. government, in terms of net government investment, when you subtract out depreciation, that is the wear and tear over time. You're talking over a period of decades. You get down to a situation where government investment is virtually zero at this point when you subtract out for depreciation of that. This is net investment, not just equipment, but net investment. And if you, I would imagine that if you subtracted out DARPA and the funding of DARPA for hypersonic weapon systems and so on and so forth, it'd be whittled away even further. Even though those might have some spin-offs, obviously you can't
DARPA
live
stands
in
for
the
what?
defense.
So it's defense.
It's research.
Defense Appropriations Research Project Agency, is that close?
Okay.
Advanced Research. Defense Advanced Research
Okay.
Projects Agency. They do a lot of, they provide money to corporations, they sponsor research, some of it, black box, some of it's semi-public, but that's where a lot of the work, or most of the work, is somehow, it's under that umbrella in terms of advanced weapon systems and so forth and stuff. New systems, not revamping all existing
Also, things like the internet was first.
If that didn't carry to the camera, the internet was a product of DARPA research. Joel is adding. So, all right. This also extends to such areas as what's called non-domestic structures. We've had a continued collapse of non-residential structures, factory buildings, facilities, non-housing structures has been continually decline. Government spending, there was an increase in government spending, immediately after the crash, because the Obama administration went into, its program of pushing cash out into the economy, subsidizing refrigerator purchases and car purchases and everything else. But but that of course disappeared long ago, just to mention that in passing. And so the consequence is, of this, as well, is in labor productivity. There was just the other day, this is the Houston Chronicle, April 29th, this is Friday, right on the front page. Why has economic output slowed? Answers range from depressing to optimistic. What it states in summary, it's a New York Times article, originating out of the New York Times, is that the labor force, the number of hours worked by Americans, has been growing by about 1.9% a year. And you know, and I know that that's been shifting towards the direction of McDonald's hamburger flipping away from
And 2 and 3
skilled
jobs.
Yeah, and 2 or 3 jobs, right.
Yeah.
And productivity, as best they can measure it, has been only increasing at the same rate. That is, that the increases in output are totally accounted for by the increasing number of hours being worked. There's no increase in productivity, measurable productivity in the U.S. economy. And it says, we could chalk that up to a statistical blip if it were a single year. Productivity data are notoriously volatile. But this has been going on for some time. From 2011 through 2015, the government's official labor productivity, let me go to the inside here, measure shows only a 0.4% annual growth in output per hour of work. That's the lowest for a 5-year span since the 1977 to 1982 period, and far below the average of 2.3, and on and on with numbers. And then they say, productivity is one of the most important yet least understood areas of economics. Over long periods, it is the only pathway toward higher levels of prosperity. But we don't understand what it is, they say. The reason an American worker makes much more today than a century ago is that each hour of labor produces much more in goods and services. But bluntly, if the kind of productivity growth implied by the new data published Thursday were to persist indefinitely, your grandchildren would be no richer than you. And obviously, far worse off, actually, in reality. But then, so this is just the other day. Well, this is, it's reflecting what's going on. There's an ongoing debate among policymakers, any of them that have, some wits about them, that, hold on a second, we're going nowhere. We have no growth. Total business fixed investment has fallen by an annualized rate of 4% just this year so far. Total investment is going negative, right? And labor productivity is the lowest that it's been by far, lowest since in the entire post-World War II period.
I think it's so worth developing the term productivity. Decades ago, when I started finally learning about the economy through LaRouche, I kept thinking, my husband's working so hard, extra hours, I'm working hard. What do you mean we don't have any productivity? I mean, Americans are working longer hours, more hours.
Right.
So I think it's very important to develop the concept of how we're measuring productivity. What does it mean? Does it mean that you speed up the factory line and you produce more products by, speed up? So can you develop that?
Well, yes, we can develop it some more. This is what figures like net investment in equipment, net investment in structures, and so on and so forth. Government expenditures minus depreciation and so forth, all are getting at indirectly, which is that increasing productivity is based on the development of the creative powers of your workforce, of your population, of your citizenry generally, with an emphasis on developing the next generation as geniuses relative to yours, to your generation. It's the development of those creative capacities, which then allows for breakthroughs and understanding of principles, scientific principles, of new scientific principles, and the application of those new breakthroughs in knowledge to technology, to applications, with the general effect of increasing the energy flux density throughput, that is the amount of energy that can be applied to a given area by a physical process, by a tool, as comparing a laser, what a laser can do in terms of machining relative to what a torch can do, a handheld torch. That reflects both a new understanding of physical principles in terms of the organization of atomic and subatomic processes, but then it's the application to real world questions. So, for example, with laser machining, you can get tolerances that are far higher than any that we've been able to develop beforehand. Now we have 3D manufacturing developing, which is not limited to printing. This term 3D printing gets used, and I think it's confusing for most people.
Yeah.
It really is, the core of it is 3D manufacturing, where you're utilizing lasers to a large degree, and you're utilizing powders, powdered metals, powdered plastics, so forth and so on, and you're literally using, very advanced digitalized CAD type programs to build layers and layers on top of layer to build an actual object as it's required. An object that might otherwise be manufactured and welded and whatever out of 12 different parts can be manufactured or produced as a single part. But this is it literally the laser is literally welding, if you will, at the atomic level, at the molecular and atomic level, these particles together, right? So it becomes one seamless piece of material, and you're able to utilize mixes of alloys to achieve, as opposed to you're achieving alloys that would not be able to be achieved under normal circumstances.
So how does the U.S. government measure productivity in their way? Because it's important for people to understand that. I mean, I used to think it was how hard Americans are working, how many hours they're working. I'm talking about many decades ago, right? And that was productivity. But how does the U.S. government come up with their statistics on productivity?
Well, I think that's where I think it's really important to get away from the statistics side of it. It shows here. In the most basic measurement, you're taking gross domestic product and dividing by the number of man hours worked in your population. Or of course, you're doing it by sector of the economy, but that's what you're doing. You're taking GDP, which is dollar value added. It is increasing the productivity of a Las Vegas casino worker, an actual increase in the productivity of the U.S. economy in terms of durable survival, as I mentioned that topic, or that concept earlier. You take other, marijuana, dispensaries. I mean, you can go on, but the point is, we have now, as a consequence of decisions that began to be made back in the 70s or even late 60s, we've had the shift into a service economy and out of investment in the physical economy. And we've rationalized that. But in fact, in the process, we stopped, we put the brakes on the kinds of investment that would increase real increase in productivity in terms of physical output. Because we're not producing what needs to be produced, first of all. And secondly, we're not advancing in terms of our knowledge in the way we could, or applying the knowledge we might have sitting on the shelves. We're not applying that anymore. Does that help?
Yeah.
So this is where the concept of, I mean, first of all, this is where NASA, the science driver of NASA, comes in, and as a technology driver. Keisha's campaign, our campaign on NASA is so critical because it's the revival of NASA that could begin to reverse in a fundamental way this on a multitude of layers. You have the cultural aspect as well as the question of actual, breakthroughs by going to the edge of knowledge, going to the frontiers again. So I'll just mention that in passing. We're spending 0.5 cents out of every federal dollar today goes for NASA. A half a cent out of every dollar of the federal budget goes for NASA. At the height of the program in 1966, it was 4.4 cents out of every dollar of the federal budget went to NASA. We're in roughly constant dollars. If we're spending now about 18 billion a year on NASA. The current budget, 17, 18 billion, is being debated and fought over and so on and so forth. But it's tiddlywinks. That's 0.5 cents, and whether it's going to be less or we're going to, in some way, try to sustain it at 0.5 cents. We spend more on pizza here in the United States than we spend on NASA. People spend more on pizza than we spend on NASA. Right?
That's just.
Joel joked in the back that that's just in this office in terms of the pizza. 4 point, so that's 18 billion. If we were spending at the 1966 levels, we'd be spending in the ballpark of 47, 48 billion a year on NASA. You can compare these things in different ways, but you're talking about really an order of magnitude difference at least. But I want to come to the question of rail in the same way or a related way. Last year, Mr. LaRouche emphasized that there's one idea. Maybe he would frame it differently now because he's always thinking and working on these things as we all try to do and try to keep up with it. But he stressed that the only way, the single way, he said, well, let me just quote him. This is May 25th at a meeting last year in 2015. The only way that you can revive the real economy of the United States is by creating a transport system which is based on the railroad concept. You've got to think about how can you produce a productivity factor among the ranks of the people of the United States. What industry, what particular thing is feasible? And he says, now what China has been doing with rails, for example, is a signal to the United States as to what the United States has to do to recover the economy of the United States. And he emphasizes handing out money isn't going to work. Right? How do you build up a workforce that you no longer have? Because we don't have a skilled workforce anymore.
We don't have tool and die makers.
We don't have tool and die makers. Yeah, we don't. We have here in Houston one of the greatest the second largest concentration of engineers and architects in the country, 92,000 here in the greater Houston area. It's the second highest number in the country at last report.
92,000?
Engineers and architects.
We have the highest number?
Second highest.
Oh, second.
Right now, a lot of them are unemployed.
Yes. I know a lot of them.
So I mean, there's capabilities you have in different parts of the country, you know that you can launch with, in terms of a specific kind of Marshall Plan or development programs, right? To launch a system, to launch an effort. But nonetheless, how do you upgrade a workforce? Are you going to just turn a bunch of kids loose building nuclear power plants?
No way.
I'm not afraid of radiation, but I don't think they're going to, it's not going to work, right? What are the stepping stones? How do you upgrade? Well, the railroads. And this was done, in fact, with the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. Jeff Steinberg in EIR a few years ago had an excellent article on kind of taking people through the history of the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, which was launched by Lincoln at the beginning of the Civil War, and carried on through the Civil War, right? And really wasn't built, the bulk of it, until after the Civil War and after he was gone. But he saw it as absolutely the lever by which you could upgrade the workforce, and in the case of the actual construction, it turned out redeploy the youth that had just been put through the Civil War on both sides, North and South, and redeploy them into great projects, a great project. So that's the point that we're making in terms of rail today. If you haven't seen it, I think most of you have seen it, but our audience may have not read it yet. LaRouche published "The United States Joins the New Silk Road, a Hamiltonian Vision for an Economic Renaissance." And in just the section in terms of building out a high-speed rail system in the United States, a 42,000-mile system, you're talking about needing 10,000 locomotives. Well, we produce locomotives in Fort Worth, Texas. They're producing diesels, but they could be converted to producing electric, which is what we want to move to in terms of a high-speed rail system, or diesel-electric combines. Right? Not that we're going to produce them all here in Fort Worth, but the point is we have capabilities right under our nose. It's going to require 50,000 megawatts of electricity. That's at least 50 nuclear power plants that are going to be required to power a 42,000-mile grid. Now, why 42,000 miles? Maybe it's just stated in the pamphlet, but 42,000 miles is the length of the federal highway system. So if you think about how the federal highway system knits the country together, more or less connecting the whole country, right? That is the start of a national high-speed rail system. Would have to essentially duplicate that. Okay, we have just by comparison, we have about 120,000 miles of high-speed rail in the country right now. But that system moves only about 3% of the freight of the United States. 3%. 3% in terms of value, 9% in terms of weight. The entire rail system. That rail system is half of what it was in 1970, before deregulation. Before we said the government no longer has a role in terms of regulating prices and ensuring the maintenance of the system. And again, this goes back to the question of productivity. Because the role of the government in terms of maintaining the system, you have to maintain prices at a certain level, right, to ensure that there's enough throughput into the outfits that you're dealing with, public or private, that they can reinvest to maintain their rolling stock, their rails, and so on and so forth. If under a heavily competitive system, which is cash, it's how much I can make today, and what's my stock going to be valued at tomorrow based on how much I make today, those investments are not made. And as a result, a rail system is half of what it was in 1970. But think about the highway system. That's paid for by taxpayers' money. So we maintained a quote-unquote government-funded, regulated highway system, but we shut down the rail system of the United States, having it, in 30 years, 30, 40 years. And destroyed a system that could move freight at a fraction of the cost of moving it on the highways. And we guaranteed what you compete against every day rolling down Highway 59 or I-10, which is these 18-wheelers, which are moving goods at a far more costly rate. They're producing smog. They're, you know, and they're tearing up the highways because the highways were never built to withstand those 18-wheelers at the utilization rate that they're using it for now, right?
Does it cost
So now we're reaching a limit to the highway system. We can't even maintain the current highway system. It's deteriorating, right?
And then
Plus,
you get a toll
even
system
if you
on
could-
top of it that they make you pay for and say, well, once the taxpayers have paid off this toll system and it's paid itself back, then it will no longer be a toll. Well, they lied.
Yeah, right. And in Austin, one of those tolls just went bankrupt. You know, just,
Yeah.
yeah.
Is there no subsidy from the government for rail right now?
Well, I could be wrong, and
But it's mainly private. That's
It's
the point.
private.
It's mainly
I mean, you have Amtrak, and you have some subsidy to Amtrak, some of that, but that's extremely
But
limited.
the old
systems like the Mass Bay Transit
Uh-huh.
Authority, right, they bought some of they took over some of the stuff from Amtrak, the ones that were viably commercial,
like Boston,
routes.
New York,
Yeah.
Hartford, and yeah.
in Boston to
I don't know if this is carrying
Yeah.
to the TV, but we're discussing this carries.
The
Okay, good,
subsidy.
good.
So, what was the percentage of taxpayer help or funding of the rail in 1970, or subsidies as we call them?
Well, it's the major role. I mean, first of all, there was the transcontinental. I mean, if you take the transcontinental railroad as an example, I mean, there was railroads.
That was completely government, wasn't it? Or
Well, no.
investing in private companies?
No, there's the Central Pacific, the Southern Pacific, the Northern Pacific.
But didn't they get loans from the government to do that?
They got loans. They got paid a certain amount. $12,000 up to $48,000 per mile of line track laid, depending on the terrain. In other cases, they were giving alternate plaques of land on opposite sides of the rail, along the rail, as a means of paying. There was
tracts of land.
government tracks, yes. I'm trying to think
And
of
people
another
were
word.
encouraged to go, build new tracts of land.
Yeah.
Speak loud if you're gonna speak.
So so there was all that. But the point I would make is that the government, and of course the government surveyed it by and large. Army Corps of Indian Engineers and so on and so forth surveyed for these rail lines. The number 2 general under Sherman was the world expert on rail. And so he had to wait until after the war was over before he could go back to finishing the Transcontinental Railroad. But
But there's no high-speed rail.
but there's no high-speed rail in the United States. We've reached the limit on highways, so we have to move. If we're just not going to just jam up, we're going to have to move to build a high-speed rail system. Hal Cooper's proposal as a railroad expert and consultant, what he outlined, which is where our proposal comes from in terms of a rough draft, is much more detailed. It's a 42,000-mile system built along existing rail lines. So you don't get into this question of seizing private properties and so on. You don't get into a big fight over eminent domain. But you utilize existing right-of-way already owned by rail companies to build out a high-speed rail system. But then as you're building that out, you simultaneously more or less begin building out a maglev system that runs along the highway system in the area between, what's it called, median. The median between on the federal highway systems, right? You do use the median to build out raised maglev systems as another 42,000-mile system. So you begin, the average freight train, and I'll get to you in just a second. I just wanted to finish this since the U.S. rail moves at an average speed right now of 25 miles an hour. Okay. The point, high-speed rail For passengers, 125 miles an hour. For freight, it can vary, but down to 50, 80, in that domain is what you could do with a modern high-speed rail system, without getting into the question of maglev. So we could vastly increase the throughput in terms of transportation. We could dramatically lower costs, right? And utilize modern intermodal methods, as opposed to kind of trying to tack it on to what we have existing today. You had,
Yeah.
Sir, Gary. Yeah.
Gary,
Oh, dear. Excuse me.
I'm just thinking about when you started out. I think you were saying that, you was trying to explain the purpose or the reason we're in this situation we're in today. And, it seems to be really, vast, but complicated in its own sense. But what I'm really trying to ask is, okay, first, the railroad. That's a good idea. But you said we had a dilemma because of years. But I've read somewhere where in the past, not too long ago, to west and east coast, it's Amtrak on those two coasts. But the dilemma is that the rest of the country don't really, support them, because it's not, something that's, pertinent in the middle of the country. But not only that, I've been hearing where infrastructure, like the roads and the highways, and bridges, everything is deteriorating. And the government mentioned Obama's or his administration sort of trying to push, to create jobs and boost the economy.
Huge deficit, $4 trillion deficit.
What I'm getting at is, why isn't anything being done?
No.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like we're just standing still doing nothing.
Right. And that's because the banks are choking on their own spit. The banks, we turn the economy from a producing economy into a financial, speculative global casino. The money from JP Morgan Chase that you deposit at your local branch, or B of A, or Wells Fargo, or what, that money doesn't stay in the community. Bank lending by banks in local communities is shrinking every day, every year, every day, every month. That money into a local account at JP Morgan goes into the global casino, into the international derivatives market. And that's what Kashkari, yes. Thank you. Kashkari was pointing out, is that this derivatives position of the banks, which on average is $60 trillion for every one of these too big to fail banks, 60 trillion, right, that's where the money went. And it's keeping that ball in the air, preventing a default, a systemic default from ripping through that global casino, which is what has frozen any investment into the real economy. Okay, so that's on the one hand. On the railroads, I would just say very briefly, I'm not saying we couldn't build railroads because of a lack of engineers. I was just indicating that a lack of skilled workers, that's something that varies by region, to region, and we have certain resources here we often don't think about in terms of how they could be redeployed, right? It was a kind of a sideline. But the point of building rail is that this is something you can put people immediately into, even without skills. They can learn skills on the job. They can move up the ladder, right? They can move up the ladder to more skilled positions and go on to other fields, and so on and so forth. So you can take a workforce, a sizable, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of young men and women. You can move them into the workforce in a productive way and do it over a sustained period of time. Here's where the war danger comes in, which is, while we're collapsing and choking ourselves, right, on a monetarist system, which is not the American system, it's not the Hamilton system, it's the British financial speculative system, right? On the other side of the world, you have the new Silk Road. You have the Eurasian land bridge, which we've discussed many times here in this forum already. But you could take many examples of this where we're not investing. On the other side of the world, they are, and they're coming here as well. China has a $40 billion investment that they're putting into Pakistan. They built the rail, they built the highway from the north-south, from China into the central part of Pakistan, and now they wanted to carry it the rest of the way through.
Rail.
But they're also building out the rail. And they're building out a pipeline system. All of it going north-south through the entire country of Pakistan. Now, Pakistan has committed 9,000 troops. They formed an entire army, if you will, to guard that system from terrorists and so forth, to ensure that system is built out and is able to function. This is not a lopsided China's doing this and da-da-da. This is something that countries like Pakistan see as absolutely critical to their very existence, right? And they're committing tremendous resources to that aim, which you don't read about in the U.S. press. The building out of these new ports, these large ports in Bangladesh, in Iran, in Pakistan on the coast. These are $10–20 billion huge port facilities, right, that are part of the maritime Silk Road, which then link into the Suez Canal. And we heard from the Egyptian Consul General's office a few weeks back on the doubling of the Suez Canal that was completed in 12 months. Ecuador, you just had the completion of the largest dam that has been built by China outside of China. But it wasn't just built by the Chinese, it was built in conjunction with Ecuadorian firms and Ecuadorian labor. And it's now launched, it's begun startup, the dam's completed, the hydroelectric facilities are being started, and it will produce 30% of the electricity of Ecuador. They'll need more, but for now it's going to produce a whopping 30% of its energy needs, right? The China is now the largest investor and not just purchaser or whatever, but investor, lender and investor in all of South America. Number one. The U.S. is not even in the running. When I was in New York, I was at an event at the Asia Society there. The Asia Society is nationally headquartered there. And speaking was the lady, if using that word, guardedly, that oversaw the TPP process. She was speaking, but also on the panel was a Bolivian and a Peruvian and an Indonesian. And the Peruvian just said, we tried for years to get the United States to invest money into projects here. And it wasn't because of due diligence. It wasn't because of a lack of transparency on our part. They walked away. We had deals signed and they walked away. Only the Chinese have come. It was like it kind of exploded in the middle of this discussion, about the TPP and our role and how much we have to offer developing countries, and the ambassador from Indonesia, or minister, government minister from Indonesia spoke along the same lines. I mean, they were very circumspect and diplomatic in terms of their American friends, but they were spelling out that this is the reality. This is what the rest of the world is doing, and that's where the war danger comes from. Is that our dying system, our financial oligarchy, has no way of maintaining its position in the world under these conditions without giving up its very basis of existence. It's committed to a dying monetarist system, right? And the power that it's accumulated by destroying the other centers of power, the other centers of industry, of agriculture, of the population, of destroying the very population of the transatlantic region. Wherein you have a Eurasian perspective, which has emerged with the BRICS nations and the New Silk Road, which is completely the opposite, based on the cooperation approach, win-win approach, which is based on the idea, well, let's build it out. Let's build out the infrastructure. Let's upgrade the skill levels of our population, upgrade their productivity. Let's create a future, you know, for us both, for all of us. So it's a very, you know, it's in a certain way, it's hard for many people to grasp. They don't see that, right? They see the conflicts, they see what's, you know, on the front pages of the paper at best, or on TV. But it's taking them to the deeper level that's critical, and it's certainly more and more what the debate on is in if you will, the corridors of power, and should become much more the basis of debate in this presidential election. Yeah.
Oh, just from the town talks the other night at the Harris County Democratic Party, they had a guy there from Texas Central, and they're talking about building a high-speed rail based on an existing system from Japan that has never gone off the track in 50 years. And so they would literally import the Shinkansen N700i from Japan, with all the safety mechanisms that go with it.
Mm-hmm.
And they would, a lot of it would be elevated. It would be run from South Dallas to Houston. They haven't started building it yet. They're still going through the environmental impact and eminent domain and all the other stuff.
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
You said this is from Central Texas?
It's a private company. Tim Keith is the CEO, and the second guy is Richard. In command is Richard Wallace.
So they already have contracts for this?
Well, they're
Privately.
yeah.
Okay. I know there's been so much talk over the years for this, so you mean there's progress in terms of?
Yes, it's already planned out.
I don't know. It's
Oh, I knew it was
progress.
planned out
He
decades
said,
ago.
he said that
Let me.
all of these.
Yeah, well, I
Yeah,
can
let
say
me
something about
intercede.
that.
I'm here. I was
Yeah.
trying to put my finger on this, just so people understand. You can Google it and look at it. It's called the U.S. High-Speed Rail Association, and they've got a website. And there's pictures of Jerry Brown, and there's pictures of other leading lights of the push for so-called high-speed rail here and there. But let me and here's the perspective. You know, see if you can. First of all, we have a bold vision for 17,000 miles of national high-speed rail. We have the USHSR project pipeline set up to advance projects from conceptual stage to investment-ready status to attract private investment by selecting and presenting projects to develop and move forward, whatever that means, highlighting unique projects, assets, and potential returns, packaging projects with land assets for profitable real estate development around stations, optimizing station locations for highest ridership and real estate development returns, assembling financiers, investors, and development partners to move projects forward, building widespread public, business, and political support for the projects. I mean, maybe it's not as transparent to you as I think it is. This is, you know, this is private, and these are real estate investment operations.
Right.
These are financial swindles. You're not going to build out a national high-speed rail system. No, I'm not criticizing you. I'm just saying I'm being
That's their
political in general.
intention, yeah.
You know, by building a railroad to Las Vegas, you know, on one end of the coast, and another little railroad, you know, to Florida or Endicott or whatever down there in Florida. You're not going to patch it together with these pieces of, you know, kind of public-private financed operations on utilizing eminent domain and all the other things along the way. It's not going to function. And it's pie in the sky at best.
It's almost like trying to make a tourist attraction from going to the moon with private partnerships of the space program. You know, like, well, we can make some money off of it and people can go and, you know, have a cocktail on the moon, and that's supposed to be a national mission.
What about your question?
Which one?
No.
At the event.
Oh,
Well, Betty brought up, didn't you bring up the Chinese model? At the
Yeah.
end?
yeah, he says, well, that's all public government funded.
Yeah.
And then another guy in the audience said, well, you know, you're talking here to a bunch of Democrats, and we all believe that the government should fund these things.
Huh.
And that's, you know,
But he did make one good point, which is that there is no current regulations on the books for high-speed rail in the United States government, and that this is forcing the issue so that they have to set up a standardization of rules to guide high-speed rail. And that would also include, you know, Homeland Security and TSA and, you know, all kinds of stuff.
You know, I looked into the system that they were talking about, the Japan system. The Japan system that the rail technology comes from was actually pretty amazing. They built it up as a whole network across all the islands. And they're still building to connect all the islands onto the mainland. And then they had to build totally new rail. They didn't care about them in Japan, I guess. We're just gonna do it. The old rail is too curvy. We can't go fast on these things. And so, but they did it, and they had a president that really committed it so much that when he came out of presidency, I think it said that he quit after a while, president. He resigned in order to finish up the rail.
Oh,
Yeah.
that was his priority.
Yeah, that was his priority. To make sure that because it was going over time and over budget or whatever. He said, "Well, we got to finish this." And it's just a little ironic that that's where we got the technology from.
Right. And they got their ideas originally from us.
Yeah,
I mean, in terms of the American system approach.
100 years.
100 years ago.
Yeah, they built these.
Time to re-import
So why isn't what is it our government? Why are we dragging our feet on? This is what I'm really trying to.
Because we haven't impeached Obama yet.
No, it's not just one single president. Because this is something that should have been done.
Yeah.
Quite a long time.
We didn't impeach Bush either.
Well, we've got a problem on our hand. We've got to stop this war drum, and Obama's ouster is absolutely critical for that to happen, and that's got to happen immediately. And that's the immediate importance of the 28 pages, and the implications of the 28 pages is it gives us a handle to do that. But in the process of that, what you're doing is you're breaking the control of Wall Street and the City of London over the U.S. government. The U.S. government and the control of the FBI over the U.S. government. Harley Schlanger was pointing out this morning, I think, did he originate it or was somebody, I think maybe anyway, somebody brought it up and he passed it on to us if he didn't bring it up himself or come up with it himself. The clear example of this guy, is it Lenny Hastert? Is his first name Lenny or? Hastert, the former Speaker of the House.
Dennis
Hastert. Huh? Who's now going to prison, right? For molesting boys back when he was the wrestling coach at the local high school or something. Well, the point that Harley was making was this was known about for decades. This wasn't something that just suddenly came up. Exactly. The FBI. This was known about for decades. The files existed on this. He was being subjected to blackmail. There was an extortion operation going on in terms of millions of dollars, right? And he was entrapped around this these payoffs and so forth, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, that's all in the papers. But the point here is this is how the FBI operates. You don't think that affected the way Hastert made decisions when he was Speaker of the House? And why he may have been made Speaker of the House?
Right.
And why he was, quote unquote, trusted by the establishment to be Speaker of the House? And how many other stories similarly. So the FBI side of this is a very real side. You've got to rip out this apparatus that's been built up in the United States, dating from the death or prior to the death of Franklin Roosevelt. This growing Wall Street FBI, City of London control. If you do that, then you've cleared the way for the American system. You've cleared the way for national credit. That we, as the people, deliberating, can determine a course for the future. And we can create de novo and extend the credit that will finance those projects, which will more than pay for themselves. And that's how we built this country up. And we can do it again. The high-speed rail would more than pay for itself. Far more than pay for itself.
It's also nothing groundbreaking in science. It's just something that's known and been known for decades. We just have to implement it.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing groundbreaking scientifically about it.
It's a technology driver, a productivity driver, a trainer of the workforce. It's not a substitute for the science program. Quite the opposite. The science.
Can I also try to address more broadly? Hi, Joe. What's your name? Derek. I mean, look, there was an induced paradigm shift toward insanity that well, I don't remember Roosevelt, but I remember Kennedy, right? And when Kennedy was shot and the FBI was in on that, and London and the British elites and so forth, right? All the grand vision that Kennedy represented around NASA, around railroads, around nuclear energy, around water development, around a generous policy toward Africa and the third world went out the window, and around, a new culture of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, green environmentalism and Wall Street, and it was all British. Baby boomers were told in every college and university that we don't need industry anymore. That's what we were told. We've got a post-industrial society. It's all going to be information and finance and entertainment.
And instead of studying engineering,
and credit cards, And this was pushed everywhere, right? So the British, totally engineered a cultural shift away from all the stuff that Brian's been talking about. We're just having fun and making money, just living for the day and not thinking about tomorrow. And and now we're reaping the consequences of that. But and then then it got worse with Nixon and almost every subsequent president.
Okay, well, look, so the point is that they're still in the American DNA, as Linda LaRouche has emphasized, the capacity to respond to this if given leadership, and you have. As reflected in the 28 pages fight, you now have leadership being expressed. I mean, the 60 Minutes show didn't drop 3 weeks ago, as an accident, and it wasn't ordered by Martians or something. It happened because there were people in the United States institutions that decided we've got to go with this, and that you have Schumer, who's the number 2 in the U.S. Senate on the Democratic side, pressing that this has got to happen, that JASTA's got to happen, and so forth. He may have mixed reasons and so on, but this reflects a broad institutional shift that's occurring. I mean, they've had to have the FBI there. Yes, there was a cultural paradigm shift, but cultural paradigm shifts can be undone. They can be reversed. They can be changed. They're not. It's not. It's not. They haven't physically altered our brains. In terms of our capacity to create.
Except for the get sucked into the drug culture.
Well,
Brian, I know I don't want to belabor this point, and it has to, but can you explain why now that it was exposed and he's going to prison? Because you said, okay, think of the power the FBI had over him while he was a speaker. That makes sense. But why now?
Oh, I have no idea.
Okay.
I don't know. I'm not really interested in.
Yeah.
Denny Haster, I didn't even know his first name. So.
Right. I know.
But I didn't have others.
An example.
Yeah.
Oh, that could be. That could be.
Or he could write a book or something, right? a tell-all book or
Oh,
something, right?
yeah.
Well, look, more
Doubt it.
importantly,
Yes.
really, I don't want to drag this thing down into negativity. We've got dangers, but look, the FBI is under the gun right now. They're the ones being exposed in all the media, all the cover-up that they were involved in with the Saudis. That's what's all over the press. That's what's shifting. I mean, I really think that's more to the point, than.
Bob Graham said it's aggressive deception.
Yeah.
And it was on NPR. He wasn't just
Yeah.
singing it in the shower, it was on NPR, right? I mean, so, it's a changing dynamic. It's really a more fluid dynamic that we have. And we.
Why, I would be curious to know why there wouldn't be, or maybe there really has been an effort to criticize Graham, to have the FBI attack him and say he's a pedophile or what have you. I mean, I guess there's some of the Congress people who actually do have a clean enough record that it's really hard to blackmail them,
Yeah. The interview with the New York congressman, retired New York congressman.
Gallagher.
Gallagher.
Yeah.
Neil Gallagher in EIR. Really goes to that point. I encourage you to read it. It's like a 4 or 5 page interview. It's lengthy, and he goes through what Roy Cohn and Hoover directly tried to do and how they failed, and he kept fighting, and
because we had the,
succeeded in many ways.
I always
And he
think back to Scott Ritter, and,
Uh-huh.
because I remember when Scott Ritter was trying to say that there were no weapons of mass destruction and giving detailed analysis as to why he felt that was the case, and how we ended up getting lost, and I'm sorry to say, even some of my relatives fell into that Fox News thing about, oh, he's a pedophile, or he's taking money from Saddam, and losing the argument of, wait a second, we're about to, let's look at the crucial points here that he's making, and not worry about whether he's a pedophile or not. Let's deal with that later after we decide whether to go to war or not with Iraq. I mean, and we just totally went away from that, and what a horror we have as a result of this character assassination that they seem to do whenever things go in the direction they don't want.
Yes.
Yeah,
And LaRouche.
Yeah, all throughout the 80s, after LaRouche candidates won in a primary in Illinois, right, for state offices, then the ADL of B'nai B'rith came out attacking LaRouche, neo-Nazi, anti-Semitic, political extremists, so that every time they mentioned his name, Lyndon LaRouche, political extremist,
Or a communist, or
Racist,
Everything under the dragon wing.
KKK members.
And
The last one I
and
think.
Israeli agent too. That's,
Oh, wow.
And the FBI ran a giant panty raid. 400 FBI agents showed up in the LaRouche National Headquarters in Leesburg, Virginia, and they were all armed to the teeth. And they were going to stage a shootout outside of the house where Lyndon LaRouche was staying.
Joe Reagan.
We're moving on. We're still here. We didn't. Lynn fought. There's more that can be gone through. Other questions? I mean, pertinent to what I was presenting that you want to add or questions? And Derek, I hope you got your questions.
Okay. I just got a.
Oh yeah.
Appointment, but-
Have you gotten that pamphlet?
Yeah.
That orange one?
Yeah, I got that.
Okay. All right. Good.
All right.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. All right.
I'm sorry, this is maybe going off the subject that we're now at, but initially when you're talking about the banks too big to fail and stuff, I kept thinking of credit unions, and how I talked to a gentleman at the last Smart Financial Credit Union annual meeting, and he was saying that that they are much more solid, that they don't loan out more monies than as Bank of America, Wells Fargo, et cetera, the fractional whatever reserve lending strategy, that they have more money in reserves than they lend out. And he was, they had published a booklet showing, look, we're very solvent, etc. But he was saying that the federal government was trying to control the federal, the credit unions now, moving in and saying now that they're going to have to answer to X person who's going to start controlling that, and how he was opposed to that, how many people are opposed to that because they're afraid. And I wondered if you'd heard anything
about that.
Well,
it's a general phenomenon. I mean, and credit unions have really been sucked into the car loan business, and it's like mortgage-backed securities. I mean, they're bundling car loans and reselling them in the.
You were saying they weren't doing that. That Smart Financial actually.
Oh, well, they
proud
that,
to say they're
that one
pulling
may
away
not.
from
I'm just
that
saying.
now.
I'm just saying.
Mhm.
Credit unions do get caught up in this
In
stuff
those
in the
types
wrong
of
way.
things, yeah.
But what's happening generally is the community banks, as they're called, the smaller, less than $1 billion total assets, and they go on down from there. Are really under the gun under Dodd-Frank. This came up at the Democratic Party meeting a week ago from a guy at Prosperity Bank. They're being forced to set aside more and more of their capital, as capital,
Right.
which they can't lend,
Mhm.
right, to have in reserve when their own structure, their own, their own exposure doesn't warrant it. But they're being, it's a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. They're being forced into the same kind of requirements that the too big to fail banks are being pushed into. But of course, they know all the loopholes, and they're playing on a bigger playing field, right?
Mhm.
The community banks have a very limited asset base, a limited depositor base, and so on and so forth.
And they have a regulator right there. I mean, they basically
On-site.
on site all the time. The government regulator, I guess they have to pay him.
They don't have
Looking at every
access to money
transaction.
market lending.
Take
A
no
lot of
risk.
things that banks use to supplement, the big banks do, to supplement their financial flows. So they're much more constricted to begin with, and they're really being, they're hurting. They're hurting, and the intention is, as with the savings loans that were shut down and gobbled up, is to simply loot them and grab their resources. I mean, just it's the big money center banks just moving to try to keep the Ponzi scheme going, and they'll grab for anything. And Dodd-Frank is a mechanism that's being used to do that. I know less about the credit unions per se, but that's the general.
That might be, yeah.
And so their lending capacity is dropping. Their ability to lend among the community banks.
How do you explain that these so-called economic experts or bankers or whatever, even recently this week interviewed on major media, when they agree about some of the financial crisis of 2008, but then they say, but the banks, because they're sort of online with criticizing the TARP, and then they said, but the banks paid back. They paid back the U.S. government. So would you explain what they mean when they say, yeah, but the big banks didn't pay back their
With
debts?
interest.
With interest, right? They say with interest.
Yeah. Bank of America says
So,
that.
I mean, I can't, Harley might be able to add more on this, certainly, but look, the Federal Reserve right now sits on $5 trillion worth of crap in its vaults of half of it's, or maybe it's a little less than half, over 30% of it is worthless financial paper, toxic paper, as they say, that they bought off the books of the banks to keep the banks afloat. So now the Federal Reserve is sitting on that worthless paper and counting it as assets when it's in fact worthless. And another chunk of it is government bonds that they bought off the books of the banks, also to give them liquidity, to keep them afloat and so on. Plus, more fundamentally, I think I referenced a quote in here, it's the damage done to the real economy.
Yes,
How many people lost their homes?
their pension. People lost their pension. Look at Detroit. Look at
It's just extraordinary what people went through. They went through hell.
That's the bigger issue,
Right.
and they get away with and these
Talking about,
interviews.
we paid it
Yeah,
back.
they paid it back, and never mind people who
What?
still are, they're out in the streets or they.
Yeah.
And they're forced to, also I know Bank of America says we were forced to take the money so that they wouldn't know which bank, to point the finger at the American public wouldn't be. And, we didn't have to take it, we had to because the government made
Right,
us.
and every one of these major money center banks have paid billions of dollars in fines, at least on paper. A lot of the money didn't actually really move into the federal coffers, but they were forced to admit to criminal activity. And just the last one was with was it JP Morgan Chase? That just Goldman Sachs, a $5 billion fine from the mortgage-backed securities back 8 years ago was just reached a
That
week
was
ago.
just to cover the Hilbert speeches.
I think
Hillary's speeches for the camera. That was a joke about just to cover Hillary's speeches.
But Brian, I think people are getting up to something because, again, the point you made earlier that it's not about the specific financial transactions that are going on and the swindle that's going on and the moving of the smoke and mirrors of these banks and what they paid and haven't paid, the interest rates. That's irrelevant. I mean, like LaRouche said, he has been saying, the entire system's coming down. It's not about the money. It's about the actual physical. It's about the actual physical productivity. Everything else is just smoke and mirrors.
So if we had a healthy, sane financial system with the Glass-Steagall and with Hamiltonian credit, then we could invest in high-speed rail throughout the continent.
As a national program.
Right.
And contract with private contractors to build, portions of it, and regional consortia of state governments might be another mechanism that would be used in conjunction with federal credit. It can be structured in lots of different ways, but it would be a national program organized from the top down.
Brian, the TPP, which is Trans-Pacific
Partnership.
Partnership, okay. So what are the real arguments against it, though I understand some of them, but even interviews even this week going on, well, we really just need to get people to understand.
Get Obama out now. Get Obama out now. I mean, look, I was talking about this, it's just a useful window, and here was this meeting at the Asia Society in New York City, and you had the Indonesians and you had the Peruvians and so forth there, along with the negotiator of the TPP agreement. And their talk, and the Indonesian woman, on the basis of question put to her, started waxing poetic about the new Silk Road, and this is absolutely essential to our future and the future of other nations in the region, and then adding kind of at the tail end, and we hope that with the TPP we'll be able to cooperate in that framework as well. I mean, the point is, world events, one way or another, are already past the TPP. I mean, either we're headed into hell, or we're going to pull this thing out with the unstoppable new Silk Road, Belt and Road. And the TPP, I'm not saying people shouldn't urge congressmen to do everything they possibly can to still string it up and prevent it from being implemented and so on. But the point is that even the countries in Asia, signing on to the TPP is like signing on to a piece of paper. They're doing other things, bigger things, and so it's a much more complicated, variegated process. Obama and some of his people want to enforce it, but it's not enforceable, and that's why we're on the verge of nuclear war, is because they haven't been able to use those kinds of mechanisms, to order affairs as they would wish. There's a new game in town. I think that's really the kind of in our own thinking. We haven't said a lot about the TPP recently, and I think that's really the basic or fundamental reason why, is because it's really not the point anymore.
But just last week, when Obama was in Germany trying to push Merkel on the TPP, and that the Europeans have to support
well, that's
it.
that's a TTIP or whatever.
Oh,
it's a companion, the European companion.
I mean,
Yeah.
that it was right after he met with the Queen,
Mhm.
and then there were 90,000 people demonstrating against it in Rome.
Mhm. Yeah. That's good. That's all tied up with the issue of the European Union and the whole British dictatorship.
Yeah,
It's
well,
over
that's
Europe.
all the whole British shithole.
Yeah.
Can you hold up the EIR to show the viewers the cover of the, not the EIR, the bridge?
Yeah.
Yeah, because
That's. Get this report.
Here's a better thing to hold up.
No, I don't want to hold that. I don't want to scare people. A picture of the Queen.
Oh, wow.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian.